You're about to meet the innovators and influencers who are restoring the Judeo-Christian foundations of our culture right here on The Patrick Coffin Show.
And now, here's your host, Patrick Coffin.
Yes, indeed, this is The Patrick Coffin Show. Welcome aboard. You've seen them. They're everywhere. They're in restaurants, they're in cafes, they're standing in the lineup to amusement park rides, but they don't seem to anticipate going on the actual ride. Their eyes are rather riveted on the glass screen device that sits in their hands like a thin golden Buddha, calling their name, locking eyes. They are Glow Kids, and they come in all ages, as it turns out. Glow Kids is an apt description for the pandemic of addictive attachment to smartphones and video games and all forms of apps and the sundry sensory avenues of escape found on smartphones and computer screens. This is what we're going to talk about today. It's the title of a book we're going to be digging into with its author, Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. The book is called Glow Kids: How Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids and How to Break the Trance. It's a practical and, I would say, wise guide for parents and pastors and teachers on how to break through the zombification. Dr. Kardaras joins us now from his internet cafe location, just kidding, in East Hampton, New York. Dr. Kardaras, thanks for putting down your own smartphone for long enough to talk to us. We appreciate it.
Patrick, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've really hit a nerve with this book. I know everyone that I've talked to, anticipating our conversation today, are saying, "Well, tell me when it's going to air," because I deal with this with my kids all the time. So first of all, thanks for writing the book. It's very important. I know that you've gotten lots of kudos, and the Amazon ratings are through the roof. So you've really hit into something. How much of this is autobiographical? How much of this is rooted in your own personal understanding that all of us are vulnerable to some form of addictive, attachment to something that's reducing our quality of life?
Well, in terms of addiction being autobiographical, as I talk about in my book, I do have a personal history with addiction in my own narrative, in my own story. So in my early 20s, I fell victim to some bad habits, which led to my own addiction issues, which I've been in recovery from for almost 20 years now. So, which also led me to becoming an addiction psychologist and specializing in the treatment of addiction. And so it was my own sensitization and experience with addiction. And then eventually I became a professor of addiction treatment. I taught at Stony Brook Medicine, where I taught the treatment of addiction, the neurophysiology of addiction. And as an addictions expert, I began to see, just about 10 years ago is when my first red flag arose that something strange is happening and we might be developing a new addictive disorder. And my first aha moment was about 10 years ago when the 16-year-old boy was sent to my office for an evaluation, and he was fully in the throes of what we would call video game psychosis. He was having a psychotic break and didn't realize what was real and what wasn't, was blinking his eyes hard and looking all around. And he'd been playing World of Warcraft for about 10 hours a night, and I kept asking him, "Do you know where you are?" And eventually, after blinking and blinking, looking around in a very disoriented way, he said to me, "Are we still in the game?" And no, we weren't still in the game. And that young man had to go to a psychiatric hospital for a month to be retethered back to reality. And that was my first hint that we're in a strange new ball game with these digital devices, and that started my journey in doing research and clinical work with screen addiction.
And we're not talking just about pornography with its obvious dangers and addictive content, but we're talking about the device itself, that mode of gaining access through, thousands and thousands of pixelated points of light, hence the title Glow. So you're not talking about even necessarily something like the Warcraft game. It's Pinterest, and it's the constant flowing now, if you will. That's the problem, right? It's not just the content; it's the thing itself and its effect on the brain.
Correct. And some content has more of an addictive potential than other content. So hyper arousing, adrenaline raising first-person shooter games which are more, let's call them dopaminergic, which means dopamine activating. So they raise dopamine levels more than some other types of digital content. But even innocuous screen experiences are dopamine activating, and that hypnotic glow rewires our brain in a very significant way. And what I was amazed to find out, and what I try to point out in my book, point out some of the research that shows the brain imaging research is black and white. It shows that radiant screens rewire the brain in essentially the same way as substance addiction does. That radiant glow creates a dopamine reward loop that the person experiencing the glow chases, just like any drug addict chases a drug high. And that could be Minecraft, that could be social media, that could be texting, that could be a first-person shooter game. Again, some content are more problematic than others, but it's the glow itself that tends to have that effect, and more so than television. Television is different than this generation of digital technology for a couple of different significant reasons. Television was passive visual stimulation, where modern digital devices are interactive, they're immersive, they're ubiquitous, and they're portable. So that old 12-inch black and white television set, while it had an ADHD effect, while it might have had a little bit of an arousing effect, not to the degree that modern devices do, because of that interactive, immersive, portable, and ubiquitous. That amplifies the screen effect exponentially.
Certainly the interactive part is key. I've never been a big gamer guy, but I can see how a few minutes of interaction with it, if you enjoy the game, you just want to stay in there, because it after a while, reality in its dull blandness can't compete with that hyper reality, the super vivid nature of it. Is that the initial hook, that kind of all immersive, absorbing experience, and that kind of crowds out everything else?
You said it perfectly. It's immersion. Immersion is a key word in screen addiction that we talk about. There's a psychiatrist in Australia he just speaks in the language of immersion. Any kind of immersive experience can lend itself to potential addictive escape. We know, again, substance abuse can have an immersive LSD experience.
Yeah.
But the screens, like you said, you can get so lost in the hyper-realism of it, and then it makes everything else a pale shadow of that. So most of the gamers that I've worked with, most of the hundreds, now it's over 1,000 people that have had screen problems that I've worked with, reality becomes a pale copy of the digital world. There was Dr. Monkey was an education expert, and he talked about the digital world compresses space and time in a way that lessens our ability to be patient with. The real world is kind of slow and tedious, and you have to sort of navigate your way through it before you get to some, let's call it an exciting spike. You know, you got to go through 8 hours of work and then you get some reward. But the digital world compresses that. And so he even talked about, Dr. Monkey talked about something like as innocuous as a fishing show. In 30 minutes, you're going to catch the fish, you're going to pull it into the boat, you're going to throw it back in the water. But then when that child gets brought on a real fishing trip and they don't catch the fish and have the whole experience within 30 minutes, they're, well, I'm bored. I have an expectation that, bang, wow, whiz, this is going to happen quickly. Yeah. And so what we're doing is we're conditioning children to have these stimulating experiences constantly. And so their children are getting uncomfortable with being unstimulated. And it's no accident that we're seeing this spike in ADHD effects. ADHD rates have gone up 50% over the last 10 years. And I think it's a direct byproduct of hyper-stimulating screens, which rob children of their ability to be able to focus if they're not stimulated.
Yeah, well, that takes away my next question, which was on this causal associated relationship between increased ADHD and in times past. You can see how it's a natural progression when they spread. I mean, my wife and I remark about this. We'll be at a restaurant, and you'll have family, 4 kids, and the mom and dad around the table. None of them are talking to each other. All of them, mom and dad included, you know, they're zombified. and it's totally normal now. We can laugh about it, but it's very destructive to family life.
Right. We've gone through a seismic shift culturally over the last 10 to 15 years. The way that we interact with one another, the way that our developing brains are being shaped, have gone through a profound seismic shift. And my narrative, what I'm trying to raise awareness about, is we have embedded this process. We don't have any idea what it's going to look like 20, 30 years out. We're doing significant neurological damage, and yet we seem to have let the digital Trojan horse into our homes and into the classroom. And like you said, there's the interpersonal effect, the socialization negative impacts, the ADHD effects. They've shown, there's over 200 peer-reviewed studies that showed depression effects, anxiety disorders, addiction disorders, and psychotic effects that I've mentioned about. Children go through very pivotal developmental windows through the ages of, let's say, 2 and 7 and 8 years old. So we know language is a developmental window. We know the ability to focus and to develop our sense of attention is a developmental window. We know that our reality testing is a developmental window. And reality testing is a phrase that psychologists use when the child begins to develop a sense of what's real and what's not. And I know that I'm real, you're real. Well, a child that's 6 months doesn't have that individuation yet, doesn't realize the external world versus the internal world. What's happening is when children are developing their sense of reality testing, we're now immersing them in what I call reality blurring, hyper-stimulating screen experiences. So a 5-year-old that's playing some game on a 52-inch LCD screen TV, he's blurring what reality is at that point and is compromising his ability to be able to discern what reality is moving forward. So these are developmental impacts that are greatly under, our society has been really underaware of them. And I think part of it has been this false narrative of, well, A, it's just the way things are now, and B, they're educational. These devices are educational, so let's drop the tablet into the crib. Yeah,
and into the classroom. Classrooms, schools have completely bought into the idea that you have to reach the kids through their chosen medium or mode without looking at the dangers of the mode or the inherent problems with it. And then the next, I want to talk about control, because this seems to be at the heart of the problem too. But the next frontier, since you're Trekkie, by the way, is Trekkie offensive to you, or should be Trekker? Where do you stand?
It's funny. I've heard about that debate. I kind of like Trekkie. I'm cool with it.
Cool. Yeah. Well, the next frontier, I was going to make an allusion to the show, is VR, the virtual reality. And I had one of these things attached to me. Friends of mine got one for their kids, and I was stunned at its effect on me. I felt dizzy an hour later. It was one of these going into a haunted house, and there were creatures zipping in and out, inhabiting this house. But I could not believe the what's the fancy word? The verisimilitude. I mean, it was really very disorienting how realistic it was. And that's kind of like the 4D version of a small screen, right? Talk about immersive.
Well, that's exactly right. We're entering a strange new world, which is going to make today's screens look like that old black and white television of yesteryear.
Yeah.
I worked with a young man who's an 18-year-old video game addict, and he's a likable young man. He's pretty articulate about his experiences as a gamer. And he played his game in a virtual reality mode for the first time. And he came into my office, and he was, oh my God, I'm afraid of that experience, because he can barely stop the two-dimensional aspect of the game. And he himself, as a gamer, even realized this is that immersive experience on steroids.
Yeah.
What I find really insidious about that as well, and again, and I get it, because I'm an addictions expert and a recovering addict myself, I get why people might want to escape their everyday reality. You could have childhood issues, discomfort in your own skin, underlying anxiety, depression, the whole host of issues make people want to sometimes check out. And let's face it, kids going through adolescence is a profoundly uncomfortable period traditionally. And the traditional escapes out of the growing pains of teenagehood have been, sex, drugs, and rock and roll traditionally. But now we have this virtual escape, and if you don't like your life, if you're bullied, if you're, now you can create a whole avatar and be a whole separate identity and really inhabit that world. The problem is, as you pointed out, all these clinical effects and the seductive escape can overwhelm our everyday lives. And there's a TED Talk by the man who invented the HoloLens, the three-dimensional headset. His name is Alex Krippman, and if you watch this TED Talk, it's fairly nefarious. In addition, not to culturally generalize, but he has a very German accent, which makes it so he talks about this future world where we will all be in our own headsets and we will all be seeking these augmented and virtual realities. And that's his mission statement. And yet he flips it and he says, and that will connect us via our humanity. Somehow, in his perverted vision, if we're all walking around in our own virtual reality worlds, somehow we're going to be more interconnected as a species. Now, as an old Trekkie, the original episode of Star Trek, The Cage, had a planet where people had, there was a species that had escaped and were able to control reality with their minds. And as they said in that very prescient Gene Roddenberry episode, we're a dying species. The allure of escaping reality into a virtual reality can atrophy an entire civilization. And I think that's what's happening. I think that's what's happening in today's world.
And isn't that a window into the allure of the show, why it was so popular? Because it gave you a chance to vicariously go where no man has gone before. By definition, Star Trek is a show about escape from the confines of Earth. Obviously in a benign, entertainment way. But
and I think all good futurists show us the potential of what may lay ahead via technology. A movie like The Terminator, or anything with AI, or anything with, look, we all love our technology. We all live in the 21st century, but yet it all comes with a price. And I think good futurists show us the dark side, because if we're not aware of that dark side, it'll sneak up on us, like I think screens have snuck up on us and our children.
Yeah, it's interesting how it all of a sudden became a pandemic. They're not there, and then they're there. When I grew up, I'm a pre-internet kid, and I grew up before the days of bottled water. To me, bottled water seems so commonplace, but back then, if you told someone in 1974, in the future, tap water, which is free, is not going to be enough. People will pay, $1.50 for a bottle of water, but here they are. They're everywhere. I wanted to, first of all, before I get into control, what's the spelling of the German theorist on the TED Talk, just to send people there? Do you remember the...
Yeah, Alex Krippman. Alex Krippman, Krippman, and the TED Talk is something, if you Google his name in virtual reality TED Talk, and again, and he has during that TED Talk, they create a holographic experience on stage, and then they also do a version of what he called, for the first time anywhere, human teleportation, and then they had a virtual. Essentially, they transported one of his coworkers from across the street holographically onto the stage next to him. All very seductive stuff, by the way. All very intriguing stuff.
Magical aspect to it, yeah.
A very magical, potentially seductive aspect to it. And again, there are some of us who maybe are more vulnerable to those effects than others.
Yeah.
Just like there are some people who are more vulnerable to other kinds of addictive escapes as well. We know that people who have underlying psychiatric issues or emotional difficulties or interpersonal or family dynamic issues, they're going to be more likely to want to check out. And we're giving them a very attractive and available way to check out.
I wanted to ask you about the notion of control. When I'm at the beach, I can't control the speed of the waves. I can't control the wind patterns. When I'm, playing a video game, or if I'm surfing, Drudge Report or email, Facebook, what have you, I control everything. With a flick of my finger, it can't say no. So I'm the boss. I'm controlling all of it. So when I, because I'm feeling it in myself, I feel that compulsive draw to the glow. I mean, this is not me finger pointing as an outsider. I relate to this compulsivity thing. And I wonder how much of it is related to my need to control things. Because outside, away from that that artificial connectivity, I have to be patient. I mean, life is one long series of things that annoy you, right? And frustrations. Right. The more you escape, the harder it is to deal with those frustrations in a way that's, peaceful and just kind of accepting. And this is a way of getting into another theme of your book, and that is the power of outdoors, and to have children connect with nature in a way that stimulates an internal sense of imagination rather than a gamer's fake version of their imagination writ into the screen. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and I think you phrased it in a very thoughtful way, because a lot of people don't mention that control aspect, that empowerment aspect, which interplays with the frustration threshold. And as psychologists, we talk oftentimes when we assess a client, well, what's their frustration threshold?
Yeah.
Client X has a very low frustration threshold, a very high frustration threshold. Well, we're developing a generation of no frustration threshold beings because they haven't had to be patient or work through anything. So it's that instant gratification and piece where I control my universe. So I think that speaks to kids who feel disempowered and powerless. I mentioned in my book, Glow Kids, that I worked with a young man who had been pretty profoundly bullied. He was on the spectrum. He was a high-functioning Asperger's young man, and he came from a very dysfunctional, really toxic family situation, a lot of poverty, there were animals and roaches in the house. And he came to school one day, and cockroaches fell out of his shirt. And for the next 4 years, he was Roach Boy, and he was taunted mercilessly as Roach Boy. Now, he escaped, and there was a game called Final Fantasy XIV, where he played a universe-saving avatar that could conquer worlds and could do all these amazing things. Now, I get it. I get why Roach Boy wanted to be an avatar that saved planets, because that was a better reality than his everyday reality was, and he had a sense of power and control, like you've alluded to. So you and I think, can get trapped into that, being fairly functional adults. The more disempowered younger kids and adolescents are more vulnerable to that type of an effect. But it totally robs them of that patience and resilience threshold that we talk about, frustration threshold, and takes away their sense of resilience because they can't tolerate any sort of discomfort because of that conditioning that they've gotten through screen experiences.
And this is a phenomenon I've noticed in the way parents relate to kids and vice versa. When the parent steps in to say, all right, enough of the glass screen device, or turn your smartphone off. Often, this is just me offering anecdotal evidence. Maybe you have some clinical data to back it up, but I've noticed a sharp, angry response often, like an outrage. I can't turn, how dare you take this away from me? There's a kind of an immediate flashing temper when faced with the need to turn it off now and not negotiate, 2 minutes more, just 1 minute more. Do you notice that? This kind of angry reaction to...
Well, listen, I talk about that at length in my book. Yeah. The aggression effects when you take away a child's device are very similar to a drug addict when you take away their drugs. There's an anger and a compulsive, give that back to me. And so I wrote an op-ed in the New York Post that went viral with over 3 million viewers, where a parent in Marin County reached out to me, and then I wrote about her in my second op-ed, and her 9-year-old almost hospitalized her when she took away his device. We have 10 cases in the United States where teenagers have committed matricide or patricide when their game boxes were taken away from them. Now, a couple of them had some psychiatric vulnerabilities, underlying issues, and the others that I researched pretty closely when I wrote my book were quote-unquote fairly normal kids. And this device became so compulsing for them that to have it taken away, they became very aggressive. The aggression effects are also twofold. At Iowa State University, Dr. Craig Anderson and his team, they've been studying media effects and aggressive behavior for 30 years. And, television and violent television shows, they had their impacts. But now violent video gaming is, again, that effect on steroids. So kids are getting desensitized to aggressive behavior. So you're already creating this adrenaline surging aggressive profile. And then you have this effect that you talk about, taking away the drug from a drug addict, which creates this sense of frustration. And so you put those two together, and we're having hundreds, if not thousands, of episodes of kids who are punching, kicking, hitting their parents, and more. Like I said, matricide and patricide has been the extreme end of that continuum of aggressive behavior.
You look at the psychological profile of school shooters, right? Thinking of the first ones that come to mind were the Columbine boys. And I wanted to ask you about the causal connection or the associative relationship between violent video games in the way they tap into a sense of vengefulness for years of really cruel bullying. How much cause-effect is there, do you think, in this, back to this sense of immersion in a world where you're the world conqueror, you can kick butt of the evildoers who harmed you, and then all of a sudden they go so far on the leading edge of the fantasy that they eventually act it out in reality.
Right. Well, I devoted a whole chapter in my book to the Newtown shooter, Adam Lanza, who was, I guess, a descendant of the Columbine boys, and they were gamers as well. But Adam Lanza in Newtown, Connecticut, I read the whole FBI report, the Attorney General's report. I am convinced that he had a video game psychotic episode, that he was the profile of what you're talking about, a psychiatrically vulnerable kid who had severe OCD. He was on the spectrum. He had a spectrum disorder, so his empathy and the social skills were already compromised. His mother pulled him out of school at the age of 15, and at age 15, he essentially went into a video game bunker. All he did after that was literally every waking moment he played violent video games. The FBI had audited his video game profile after the murders, and he had been playing one particular game, Modern Warfare 2, where you go as a civilian, you're a CIA operative going into a civilian airport, and you're shooting women and children in this very realistic, blood-splattering sort of way. And he had 22,000 headshots of women and children who were crawling away from him in smeared blood in this very hyper-realistic game. And then he was also playing a game called School Shooter, where the shooter, a first-person shooter, goes classroom to classroom shooting children. And that game is, people say can be a game like that. There's also a game, by the way, called Columbine, where you emulate the Columbine boys doing a school shooting. And so a kid who's got some psychiatric issues like Adam Lanza, who is immersed in these reality blurring games that feed his aggression and his revengefulness, let's call it, it's a recipe for disaster, which we saw. I don't blame the guns in that case. I blame what shaped his motivations and shaped his psyche more than I blame the instrument of what he used.
Are there efforts to make these games illegal? I'm stunned that people are permitted to put these out on the marketplace in light of the clinical data that proves their role in real-life crimes.
And by the way, the researchers at Iowa State did use the word causational versus correlational. They said the data is now clear after almost 30 years of aggression research. They've shown that media effects are causal to aggressive acts. So just to put that out there. Yeah, but there's First Amendment rights. And so there's a First Amendment veil that's protecting them, because I will tell you, there was another famous shooting case, they call it the Grand Theft Auto murders, that was on 60 Minutes about 10 years ago. A young boy who essentially simulated a scene out of Grand Theft Auto. And there's one scene in Grand Theft Auto where a person is arrested for Grand Theft Auto in a police station, disarms the one policeman, shoots and kills them, shoots and kills the second policeman, walks down the corridor and kills the police dispatcher, and then steals a police cruiser and escapes. Well, that's exactly what this 16-year-old boy, Devin Smith, did in Alabama about 12 years ago. He was found sleeping in a stolen car, brought to the precinct, and he'd been playing Grand Theft Auto for thousands of hours. And the defense attorney tried to use the video game defense, saying that this boy was in a reality blurred state, that in a state of crisis, when what triggered him is the policeman said to him in the precinct, "You might go away for a few years now because of this Grand Theft Auto crime." And they said he snapped, and that's when he went into game mode.
Yeah.
They used several psychologists on his defense team to give testimony, but the judge denied their ability to use the video game defense. The families of the policemen, however, filed a civil suit against the game manufacturers and the game distributors, GameStop, and they lost. But the families very clearly and powerfully in their civil case said, we know that our relatives, our police relatives, are dead because of these games. And in fact, there's a West Point professor who wrote a book, Teaching Our Children to Kill. And this West Point professor is an expert in this is a West Point thing called killology. And he calls video games murder simulators. These are, and let's face it, some of these combat games are militarizing our children. They're teaching them how to be soldiers. You know, we criticize ISIS for teaching their 8-year-olds how to be terrorists, but we're also militarizing 8 and 9-year-olds with these very graphic, violent military games, and you know, by design, by chance. But I don't think it's a healthy thing to be teaching children how to shoot and how to kill and how to desensitize them to those effects.
I'm still reeling from the word killology.
Killology. Children how to kill.
I guess the question of banning them is a legal question, but it seems to me that the First Amendment is subject to some kind of dilution. The famous example being yelling the word fire in a crowded theater. That's another. Go ahead.
Well, Patrick, what I'm working on is we are trying to get legislation to at least put warning labels on digital devices. That's the legislative piece here is what we're trying to at least raise some awareness, because at least if parents, and so the wording that we're trying to get is warning excessive screen usage by children can lead to clinical disorders, in the same way that the cigarette companies were forced to buy class action suit. And this is a very similar model to the cigarette industry, because in the 1950s, the cigarette industry knew that cigarettes were carcinogen, and they sat on that information. The gaming industry knows. They know that these games are addicting and that they're aggression creating. And they know because they're hiring behavioral psychologists with that mission statement. I get occasional the APA, the American Psychological Association, has classified flyers that they send to their members sometimes, and I occasionally get them in my email feed that says, video game company X is looking for behavioral psychologists to help develop and modify and create as addictive games as possible. The video game manufacturers hire adolescent beta testers, and they give them $100 Amazon cards as their incentive, as their reward. And what they do is they hook them up to galvanic skin responses and to blood pressure gauges, and then they expose them to the game. And if the game doesn't spike their blood pressure to 180 over 140 within 3 minutes, the designers go back and tweak the game to make the game more hyper-arousing, because we know the more adrenaline surging, the more dopamine activating, the more compulsing the game will be. To me, using our children shooting fish in the barrel as marketing subjects like that is evil. And the problem now has been that the technology companies have essentially conned let's call it the educational industrial complex into the false narrative that digital technology is educational. And there's not one study that shows that. There's not one study that shows that a tablet in kindergarten leads to better educational outcomes in middle school or high school.
But it's just dicta. They don't argue to it. They assume it.
The emperor has no clothes, and no one wants to call them on that. When I ask the school superintendent, I'll ask administrators, superintendents who have invested huge resources in technology, prove it. Show me the research that shows this is beneficial. You get some version of humana, 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 and not a lot of response.
Now, just turning to adult gamer addicts, you did a intervention with Elizabeth Vargas on ABC, a grown man with kids, and we think of, oh, come on, just stop it. You've got responsibilities, but people have no idea the power that addictive video games have on like gambling addiction, like pornography addiction, like drug addiction. This is something that makes life completely unmanageable, correct? What happened for folks who didn't see it?
Well, I'll back up by saying if you Google World of Warcraft and diapers, World of Warcraft and diapers, there's whole chat rooms of young people who are discussing what type of adult diapers to wear because they play the game so long and so compulsively they can't take a 5-minute bathroom break, and so they need to know which is the best type of adult diaper so they can urinate on themselves because the game is so compulsing to them.
Amazing.
So that's addiction, right? If you can't even go to the bathroom and you're 19.
Yeah.
So what we've seen is the main feature of any kind of an addiction, the main clinical diagnostic criteria is a person continues to engage in the behavior or the substance use despite adverse consequences in their personal lives. And so I've seen young people and adults whose marriages, careers, lives, and sometimes their health destroyed by their compulsion of playing these games. And so with the intervention of this 44-year-old working man with an attorney wife and 4 lovely young children, he was an absentee father who couldn't stop playing the games. And it was heartbreaking with his children. I spoke to his oldest son, who was 10 years old, who sobbed uncontrollably because in his mind, his father was choosing the games over him. His father was spending no time with him while his father would just stay in his man cave for 10 to 12 hours a night. His wife was ready to leave him. The children were devastated, and yet he couldn't stop. The intervention was successful because he agreed to treatment because he had enough. There was enough, like in many addicts' addictive slides, there's a light that sometimes goes on that says, I need help. And he was at that point. But I've gotten letters from all over the country from parents to spouses saying this is destroying our families. And people just think it's just, Pac-Man. And that's the problem. I think a lot of people of our generation, Patrick, we're minimizing it into that box. We're putting it into I played video games when I was a kid and they weren't that bad, but they don't realize how hyper real this generation of technology is.
Yeah, there's just so much ignorance. As I say, when I put on that VR mask, it took a nanosecond for me to it had the wow effect. And I'm no interest in doing it again. Imagine
if you were going through a rough patch in your relationship, maybe you lost your job, you're feeling pretty down about yourself, and you put that on, and how much more appealing would that be? Where you might say, you know what, let me take some time to just escape in that world if you're going through a rough patch in your life.
Sure,
and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's like a little escape hatch. You can just go away from the angst and the pain of reality and do something else that's a lot, not only takes the pain away, but produces all the stimulation and distraction. Let's end on a note of hope and the power of outdoors. Tell me about Eitan Potts and the End of Innocence chapter in the book and the glory of being outdoors.
Right. In my book, I talked about that sort of the beginning of what some sociologists have tracked as helicopter parenting and indoor children was the seminal Eitan Potts case. He wasn't the first missing kid, but he was the first very high-profile missing child in 1977, I think, or 79. And Eitan Potts was the beginning of parents beginning to be afraid to let their children play outside. And indoor kids eventually became computer kids because what else was there to do indoors? And there was a byproduct of very scared parents of perceived boogeymen that were outside. And the antidote has to be back to nature immersion and the power of real life experiences to overshadow digital experiences. That's the battle that we're striving now. And so the treatment protocols right now for any kind of gamer or any kind of addictive screen experience is real life immersion, and to make that as compelling and as mindful as possible. And we also do a lot of mindful meditation to be present in the here or now. And that tends to be the best thing you could do. The other best thing you could do as a parent is A, delay the onset of your child being exposed to digital screens, and B, allow your child to be bored. Developmentally, there's nothing better for your child to be bored, because then your child has to use the resources of their inner mind to create active imagination, to create images in their own mind, and that neurosynaptically builds their muscles, their brain muscles, so to speak. And so if we program our children with their visual imagery, their ability to have an imagination becomes a vestigial organ. They're no longer able to create imagery, and that's what we've seen. One of the biggest byproducts of high screen diets that I've seen is kids are no longer imaginative, they're no longer curious, they're very apathetic. I call them the shoulder shruggers. Stimulate me over and over again, rather than saying, gee, I wonder how that works, or let me use my mind to create something.
Right, and you tell them they're apathetic, and they say, who cares? Right.
Right.
What about age? You say, delay the onset. I've seen a lot of 5-year-olds with smartphones and tablets, and parents feel that they're being stoned to death by peer pressure, and the peer pressure is not from their kids; it's from other parents that they see, and they want to emulate. And they figured, well, this is a compromise. You want to pick the right ditch to die in, and so they just hand the kids their Glow devices. How is there? I know there's no template for everyone, but what do you recommend? Is there an indispensable minimum below which they just should not have them?
Well, yeah, I recommend not below the age of 10 to have portable devices. I mean, I have 9-year-old twins, and they do some desktop computer work at school, but we had a fight with school not to give them portable devices, not to give them iPads. All parents need to know is that Steve Jobs didn't let his kids have tablets or iPads, that Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the Google boys, they were Montessori students who never had a computer till they were 12. Bill Gates never touched a computer till he was 12 years old. The founder of eBay, he was also a Montessori student. The most innovative minds in technology never had technology when they were children, and that tells us something.
Yeah.
And in fact, the other part of that is that the Google and Silicon Valley engineers that live in Palo Alto, a large number of them put their children in the Los Altos Waldorf School, which is non-tech. So what does that tell us?
Yeah, that's an irony that folks shouldn't miss that. And you're right about the boringness. I'm bored. Well, good. It's the gift of boredom. Now you have to reach into your resources. Write a poem. Write a song. Go for a walk.
Right.
Family vacations seem completely dominated by these as well. Why is it important to just hang out as a family, eye to eye? Like our family loves board games. Saturday night's our board game night, and it's all low tech, and it all involves things like laughing and enjoying each other. And time seems to speed by when you disconnect. There's a kind of refreshment there that's very important for family life.
Well, yeah, I think it's all part of the interpersonal interaction. There were studies that showed that for an interpersonal interaction to be meaningful, psychologically and emotionally resonant, that eye contact has to be maintained for 70% of that interaction, and that adolescents today only maintain eye contact for 20 to 30% of the time because of the screen effect, because of the head-down screen effect. So we're losing our ability to have those very important social skills of eye contact and interpersonal connection. We also know that face-to-face human contact is life-sustaining and mental. It's a critical part of our mental health. They've done all sorts of experiments. People in isolation, people that didn't have interpersonal contact, go insane and they become physically ill. And screen devices have tricked people into thinking that they have 500 Facebook friends, but they don't have any face-to-face friends. And
right.
And the Facebook depression research has showed there's a phenomenon called Facebook depression, and it literally correlated the number of friends you had on Facebook correlated to the higher rates of depression. The more friends on Facebook, the higher the depression rates. So this is all information that's valuable, but that is sort of under the radar for mainstream America. And my narrative is, let's wake up. We have the control as parents and as adults to finally push back and to say that, look, while technology is good, look, my car is wonderful. I just don't let my 9-year-olds drive it.
Yeah.
Let's begin to be cautious about having age limits and time limits, and not just drop tablets into the womb because we think that somehow our children need a leg up on technology. Let their brains develop, and then they're able to launch and do whatever they want once their brains are fully developed. But we're developmentally dampening their brains if we immerse them in screens at too young of an age.
Well, the book's phenomenal. I really appreciate you writing it and for being such an articulate messenger of the message. I've learned a lot from this conversation. I hope folks don't walk but run to the book. It's called Glow Kids: How Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids and How to Break the Trance. You can connect with Dr. Kardaras at drkardaras.com, and in the show notes I'll put a link to the book. And Godspeed. Great to meet you and to chat. Maybe we'll talk in the future about how Pythagoras and Plato can save our lives. Another of your books.
By the way, great meeting you, Patrick.
All right, you as well. Thanks for everything. This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint, What else is there?